If you thought being buried alive was as bizarre as Roman punishments could get, buckle up. Because the Romans had an even stranger one waiting for those who committed one of the greatest taboos of all, parricide. That word sounds almost clinical, but its meaning was anything but. It meant murdering your father, or in some cases another close relative. And for the Romans, that was about as bad as it could get. To them, killing your own parent wasn't just a crime against your family. It was a crime against the natural order of the universe. Fathers were the bedrock of Roman households, the pillars of authority, the miniature emperors of each home. To turn against that was to tear at the very foundation of Roman society itself. Now, here's where the Romans got creative. They didn't just sentence parricides to death. No, that would have been too ordinary, too dull. Instead, they invented a punishment that was equal parts terrifying, theatrical, and downright surreal. It was called poena, cullei, the penalty of the sack. And let me tell you, it was every bit as weird as it sounds. The ritual started with humiliation. Before the sack ever came out, the condemned would be paraded in front of the people. His hands were tied. His head was often covered in a wolf's hide, as if to mark him as less than human, a predator among his own kin. Sometimes clunky wooden shoes were strapped onto his feet, forcing him to stumble awkwardly as the crowd jeered. The message was clear: you're not a man anymore, not even a proper Roman. You're a creature, stripped of dignity before your final punishment. Then came the sack itself. And this wasn't just an empty bag. Oh no, the Romans had a flair for symbolism. Into the leather sack went not only the condemned man, but also 4 living animals: a dog, a monkey, a snake. Why'd a ruse 4? Scholars still debate it, but the symbolism seems deliberate. The dog stood for loyalty betrayed. The monkey brought chaos and mockery. The snake, of course, represented treachery and deceit. And the rooster, with its crowing at dawn, symbolized vigilance, something the murderer had failed to uphold in protecting his family. Put them all together, and you had a living, thrashing allegory of the crime itself. Imagine that moment. You're tied up, shoved into a dark, stinking bag, and suddenly you're not alone. You feel claws scratching for brushing against your skin, the hiss of a snake slithering around your legs, the frantic flapping of wings. You hear the panicked bark of a dog, the screech of a monkey, and the rooster shrieking as if to announce your doom. The sack writhes and bucks like a living thing, a nightmare bundle of fear and fury. And then, without warning, the whole thing is hauled up and dragged to the water's edge. The final step was as brutal as it was symbolic. The sack, now stuffed with man and beast alike, was tossed into a river or the sea. Sometimes the Tiber, Rome's lifeblood, became the stage. Other times, it was whichever body of water was nearby. The result was the same. The sack hit the surface, sank, and chaos erupted inside as man and animals fought for breath, for space, for survival. It was panic sealed in leather, a storm of claws and teeth in the dark. And the crowd, they watched, they whispered, they remembered. Because this wasn't just an execution. It was a show designed to horrify and to burn itself into the minds of anyone watching. What's striking is how rare this punishment actually was. The Romans didn't have to use it often. They didn't need to. The idea of it was enough. Just hearing about it was terrifying. The thought of being trapped in a sack with a snake and a monkey, of all things, was so outlandish and grotesque that it became legendary. The horror lived longer than the condemned. That was the genius of Roman justice. The story did the work even when the punishment itself was seldom carried out. But when it was used, it carried weight. One emperor who revived the practice was Hadrian, the same emperor who built that famous wall across Britain. He wasn't just about fortifications and architecture. He also had a taste for the dramatic, and poena, cullei, fit the bill. By including the animals, he turned what was already a terrifying sentence into something unforgettable. And that's exactly what Rome wanted, not just punishment but performance. Think about it from the perspective of someone living in Rome at the time. You hear whispers that a man killed his father. Already, that's shocking. But then word spreads that he's been sentenced to the sack. Immediately, images flood your mind. You imagine the animals, the struggle, the river swallowing the sack whole. You shiver, you shake your head, and you tell your neighbor, "May the gods forbid anyone in my family from ever doing such a thing." The punishment worked because it wasn't just physical, it was psychological. It rippled outward, keeping everyone else in line. It's also worth noting that Rome's obsession with family wasn't just sentimental. The family, or familia, was the basic unit of Roman society. Fathers had absolute authority. Patria potestas, they called it. The power of the father. He could arrange marriages, control property, and even decide matters of life and death within the household. So, when someone turned on their father, it wasn't just breaking the rules of the home. It was like tearing down the very structure Rome stood on. That's why the punishment had to be so extreme. It wasn't about one man. It was about protecting the whole idea of Rome. And let's be honest, it was also about Rome's love of the dramatic. The Romans didn't do anything halfway. They liked their punishments to have flair, to leave an impression. A simple execution would have been too forgettable. But a sack stuffed with wild animals, that was unforgettable. That was Roman. If you think about it, poena cullei almost feels like a dark piece of performance art. The condemned man becomes the star of a grotesque play. The animals are his unwilling co-actors. The river is the stage. And the audience, the Roman people, wide-eyed, horrified, but glued to the show. It's gruesome, yes, but it's also theatre, and Rome knew better than anyone how to use theatre to maintain power. Even today, the image lingers. Out of all the punishments Rome invented, this one has a way of sticking in your mind. You can picture it, almost feel it, the leather sack, heavy and bulging, being dragged toward the water, the muffled cries from inside. The onlookers pressing closer, some crossing themselves, others turning away. And then, splash! Silence, except for the ripples spreading across the river. That's all. But that silence carried a message louder than any words. The Romans understood something we sometimes forget, that the scariest punishments aren't just about pain. They're about imagination. They're about what people picture when they close their eyes. And poena cullei was tailor-made for that. It took a crime so unthinkable, killing your own father, and paired it with a punishment so bizarre that no one could ever forget it. So the next time you hear about strange ancient punishments, remember this one. Remember the sack, the dog, the monkey, the snake, and the rooster. Remember the splash and the silence. Because in Rome, justice wasn't just about ending a life. It was about creating a story so haunting that it kept everyone else in line for generations. When most of us hear the word crucifixion, our minds immediately go to one image, a rough wooden cross planted in the ground, a man nailed to it, struggling for breath as the sun beats down. It's one of the most infamous punishments in history, and for good reason. Crucifixion wasn't quick. It wasn't clean. It was meant to stretch suffering out, to make death into a drawn-out lesson for everyone who happened to walk by. In Rome, crucifixion became almost a signature. It was their way of saying, "This is what happens when you challenge us." But here's the thing, Rome, being Rome, didn't always stick to the standard model. Sometimes they added a twist. Literally. One of the most shocking variations was the upside-down crucifixion. As if hanging by your hands and feet wasn't already one of the worst ways to die, the Romans found a way to make it even more humiliating and even more painful. The most famous case, of course, is that of Saint Peter. Tradition tells us that when Peter was condemned under Emperor Nero, he made an unusual request. He asked not to die in the same way as Jesus, feeling he wasn't worthy of that honor. Instead, he asked to be crucified upside down. Now, whether this account is perfectly accurate or not, the story has stuck because it captures something deeply symbolic. In Peter's case, the inverted cross was about humility. But to the Romans, it was about another kind of message. We can make death whatever we want it to be. Think about the physical side of it. Regular crucifixion was already torture by gravity. The body sagged, the chest strained, every breath became harder and harder until the victim eventually suffocated. But when you flip the body upside down, everything changes. Blood rushes to the head, veins bulge, vision blurs. The body's weight pulls in strange, unnatural ways, tearing muscles and joints in ways they weren't meant to bend. Breathing, already almost impossible, becomes a frantic struggle. It was agony layered on top of agony. Now, for the Romans, this wasn't just about the pain. They were experts in symbolism. Imagine passing by someone nailed to a cross, hanging upside down, their head where their feet should be, their body bent and straining. The image itself was disturbing, confusing, and unforgettable. It screamed disorder, inversion, the world turned upside down. And that was the point. Rome wanted to show that those who defied the state didn't just die. They were flipped, mocked, humiliated, turned into living symbols of chaos. And crucifixion wasn't reserved for anyone. It wasn't like the forced suicides we'll get to later, which were reserved for the wealthy and the powerful. Crucifixion was a punishment mostly inflicted on the lower classes, on slaves, rebels, and foreigners. It was a tool for stamping out resistance. The Romans weren't shy about using it en masse, either. After the Spartacus revolt, thousands of rebels were crucified along the Appian Way, lining the road like a ghastly fence of bodies. Imagine traveling that road and seeing cross after cross, mile after mile, each one holding a human being in slow, public decay. That wasn't punishment. That was spectacle. But when the Romans chose to make it upside down, it added an extra layer of cruelty. It wasn't just about killing the body. It was about destroying the dignity of the person completely. It said, not only are we taking your life, but we're also twisting it, inverting it, stripping away every last shred of humanity you thought you had. And let's not forget, crucifixion wasn't only about death. It was about the long hours leading up to it. Victims sometimes lingered for days. Families might stand nearby, helpless. Crowds might jeer, laugh, or throw things. Children might watch from a distance, wide-eyed, learning what happens to those who disobey the state. It was a classroom of fear, and the Romans were the teachers. The inverted crucifixion, though, carried its own special theatre. For Rome, it didn't matter if the symbolism came from humility, like Peter's request, or from sheer cruelty. What mattered was the message. We can take something as familiar as death and twist it into something grotesque. The upside-down cross wasn't just about killing. It was about spectacle, shock, and control. You can almost picture Nero smirking at the thought of making an execution more memorable. For him, executions weren't just punishments, they were entertainment, sometimes even party tricks to amuse guests. The inverted crucifixion fit that mold perfectly. It was bizarre, eye-catching, and unforgettable. And here's where things get interesting. Over time, the symbol of the upside-down cross took on new meanings. For early Christians, Peter's choice turned it into a mark of humility, a reminder that faith sometimes meant turning the world on its head. But centuries later, horror movies and metal bands would adopt it as a symbol of rebellion, of darkness, of everything opposite to the sacred. That's irony for you. A punishment designed by Rome to humiliate and control ended up echoing in ways they never could have predicted. Still, in its original form, the message was simple: Rome had no limits. No matter how brutal, how creative, or how symbolic, they were willing to make punishment into theatre. Hanging someone upside down wasn't just an oddity. It was a reminder that in the empire's hands, even death could be staged like a performance. So, if crucifixion was Rome's signature punishment, the inverted crucifixion was their flourish, their dramatic punctuation mark. It was the way they said, "We can bend even the act of dying into a show." And like so many of their punishments, it wasn't just about the victim. It was about everyone else who saw it, remembered it, and carried that fear forward. Picture yourself as a Roman soldier, standing in line with the rest of your unit after a long, exhausting campaign. Maybe you just lost a battle. Maybe some of your comrades had fled when things got rough, leaving gaps in the line that nearly cost everyone their lives. The air is heavy, no one's speaking. And then the commander steps forward with that look in his eyes. The one that tells you this isn't going to be a normal lecture. This is going to be something much darker. He raises his hand and gives the order for decimatio. You feel your stomach drop, because you know exactly what that means. 1 in every 10 men is about to die, not at the hands of the enemy, but by the hands of their brothers in arms. That was decimation, one of the most brutal military punishments ever practiced in Rome. The name itself comes from the Latin word decimus, meaning 10th. The logic was cold and terrifyingly simple. If a unit disobeyed orders, deserted, or showed cowardice, the entire group would be punished. But not all of them would be executed. No, the commander would divide the men into groups of 10, and then each group would draw lots. The unlucky man whose lot was drawn would be clubbed, stoned, or beaten to death by the other 9. Think about that for a second. It wasn't just that you could be chosen to die. It was that you might be chosen to kill your closest friend, the guy you'd marched beside for weeks, the man you'd shared bread with, joked with, maybe even saved in battle. Suddenly you had to turn on him, lift a stone or a club, and strike until he was gone. That's what made decimation so horrifying. It wasn't just the death, it was the betrayal, the tearing apart of bonds that were supposed to be unbreakable. Rome knew exactly what it was doing. By forcing soldiers to execute one another, the punishment didn't just eliminate 1 out of 10, it poisoned the trust of the 9 who remained. It left scars that ran deeper than wounds. And as if that wasn't enough, the survivors didn't exactly walk away free. After carrying out the killing, they were punished too. Their rations were cut down from wheat to barley, a not so subtle way of saying, "You've failed us." Barley was considered animal feed, the food of slaves. Eating it every day was humiliating, a constant reminder of their disgrace. On top of that, they were forced to camp outside the safety of the fort, vulnerable to weather, wild animals, or enemy attack. Rome didn't just want them to feel guilty. Rome wanted them to feel exposed. Decimation was rare, and for good reason. It wasn't something you pulled out for every minor mistake. It was a nuclear option, a punishment meant to shock the army back into obedience. When it was used, though, it sent ripples through the ranks. Soldiers who thought about deserting suddenly remembered that the enemy wasn't the only thing to fear. Their own commander and their own comrades could be deadlier. One of the most infamous cases happened during the Third Servile War, the Great Slave Rebellion led by Spartacus. The Roman general Crassus, desperate to restore discipline after his troops had been humiliated in battle, ordered decimation. Picture it: hundreds of soldiers lined up, the sound of lots being drawn, men weeping or going pale as they realized their fate. And then the brutal rhythm of clubs and stones as friends turned executioners. When it was over, the survivors were broken men, but they were obedient. Crassus got his army back in line, and Rome marched on. It's easy to see why commanders would use something like this. Fear is a powerful motivator. If you're more afraid of your own side than of the enemy, you're less likely to run. But the cost was enormous. Soldiers lived with the trauma of killing their own. Units carried invisible wounds long after the punishment was over. And yet, Rome considered it worth it, because what mattered most wasn't the individual soldier. It was the survival of the legion, the discipline of the whole. Now, imagine hearing the order for decimation. Even if you weren't chosen, you'd never forget it. You'd never look at your unit the same way again. The next time you thought about deserting, you'd stop and remember the screams, the blows, the look in your friend's eyes as he begged you not to strike. And maybe you'd tighten your grip on your shield and stand your ground, because the alternative was worse. That's the twisted genius of decimation. It wasn't just a punishment. It was a lesson carved into the flesh and memory of everyone who survived it. It said Rome demands loyalty. Rome demands courage. and Rome will break you from the inside out if you dare to fail. Imagine standing in the Roman Forum on a clear day, the heart of the city buzzing with life. Merchants are shouting prices for their goods, children are darting between stalls, senators are gliding past in their togas, and priests are making their way to temples. Everything feels alive, ordered, familiar. But then, a group of soldiers begins clearing a path. People step aside. A hush spreads through the crowd. Something serious is about to happen. At the center of this sudden silence is a condemned man. His crime: betrayal. Maybe he plotted against the Senate. Maybe he took bribes, falsified testimony, or sold secrets to Rome's enemies. Whatever the reason, he has earned a punishment reserved for the worst kind of offenders. And everyone knows what's coming next. He's about to be led to the Tarpeian Rock. The Tarpeian Rock wasn't some random cliff out in the countryside. It was right there on the Capitoline Hill, overlooking the Forum. You couldn't miss it. Jagged, about 80 feet high, it loomed like a natural stage set aside by the gods themselves for Rome's harshest lessons. And the symbolism was heavy. At the top of that same hill was the Temple of Jupiter, the very seat of Rome's divine power. To be hurled off the Tarpeian Rock meant more than just death. It meant falling from grace. Literally, from the most sacred part of the city down into the dust below. The rock even carried a legend in its name. Tarpeia was a Roman maiden who betrayed her own people during a war with the Sabines. She promised to open the city's gates in exchange for what she thought would be gold jewelry. The Sabines, in a grim twist, crushed her to death with their heavy shields, technically fulfilling their promise, since shields were decorated with shining metal. Her body was cast from the cliff, and from then on, the place was forever known as the Tarpeian Rock. The moral was clear: betray Rome, and you don't just die, you fall. So, picture the condemned man being marched toward the edge. The soldiers strip him of his clothes, sometimes beating him or mocking him along the way. The crowd follows, murmuring, pointing, watching every step. The condemned isn't being quietly tucked away in a dungeon. His punishment is a performance, a sermon played out for thousands of eyes. He stumbles as the soldiers shove him forward. At the edge of the cliff, there's no speech, no final word. There's just the drop. The fall is brutal. 80 feet doesn't sound like much in modern terms, but in a world without safety nets or medical care, it's certain death. Bones shatter on impact. The body lies twisted and broken on the rocks below. Some people gasp, some cheer, and some just nod grimly, knowing that justice, Roman justice, has been served. The beauty, if you can call it that, of the Tarpeian Rock was its simplicity. No elaborate props, no animals in sacks, no burning tunics. Just gravity, quick, final, and symbolic. The condemned was paraded in front of the gods, then cast down like trash, removed from the city, both physically and spiritually. The crowd got its lesson, the state made its point, and the whole event etched itself into memory. What made it even more chilling was its location. The rock wasn't hidden away. It was steps from the center of Roman life, right there beside the Forum where politics, law, and religion collided. Every Roman who passed that way could glance at the cliff and remember what it stood for. It was a constant reminder that loyalty was everything, and betrayal meant ruin. And think about the psychological weight. If you were accused of treason or corruption, you knew what might await you. That walk to the rock wasn't long, but it must have felt endless. Each step a reminder that you were about to be erased, that your final view would be of the city you had betrayed, the Forum below, the temples above, the people you had lived among, all watching you in your last moments. That was the Roman way, not just to punish the body, but to carve terror into the soul. Over time, Rome invented punishments that were more elaborate: lions in the arena, crucifixions, burning tunics. But the Tarpeian Rock never lost its power. There was something almost elegant about it, in a cruel way. No need for blood to be spilled by human hands. No need for elaborate rituals. Just a push, a fall, and silence. The earth itself did the killing. It's telling that even in later centuries, Romans used the phrase, The Tarpeian Rock is close to the Capitol. As a kind of proverb, it meant that glory and ruin were never far apart. One moment you could be standing in triumph on the Capitoline Hill, basking in the power of Rome. The next, you could be hurled from its edge, forgotten in an instant. The rock wasn't just a cliff, it was a warning carved into the landscape itself. And in that warning lies the essence of Roman justice: swift, public, and unforgettable. The Tarpeian Rock was less about the fall and more about the fear it created in everyone who witnessed it, everyone who whispered about it afterward. It was another piece of Rome's theatre of punishment, another way of teaching its citizens that betrayal wouldn't just be punished, it would be erased in the most dramatic way possible. Now we come to the Colosseum, that massive stone theatre where Rome mixed entertainment, power, and cruelty into one unforgettable package. Picture it: 50,000 spectators pouring into the stands, the hot sun beating down on marble seats, the smell of sweat, dust, and roasted meat in the air. People jostle for places, shouting to friends, clutching snacks. The buzz of conversation echoes up to the highest tiers, but underneath it all is an electric tension, because everyone knows what's about to happen. Today isn't about speeches or politics. Today is about damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to the beasts. The name says it all. To the Romans, this was the ultimate fate for criminals, traitors, rebels, and, tragically for many early Christians, instead of a sword or a clean beheading, you were thrown into the arena with wild animals. Lions, leopards, bears, wolves, even elephants, creatures dragged from distant corners of the empire and starved or prodded into rage. The moment the gates clanged open, the crowd erupted. They weren't there to see justice done in silence. They were there to be entertained. But leave it to Rome to make it theatrical. This wasn't just release the lions and see what happens. No, the Romans often dressed the condemned in costumes to turn their deaths into plays. One man might be dressed as Orpheus, strumming a lyre, only for a lion to tear him apart mid-song. Another might be tied to a rock like Prometheus, while birds of prey were set loose to mimic the myth. It wasn't enough to kill. It had to mean something, to tell a story. Death became a kind of performance art, equal parts horror and pageantry. And the crowd, they ate it up. People cheered, laughed, pointed, gasped. To them, this wasn't a tragedy, it was a spectacle. Just as we tune in for dramas or sports, they tuned in for blood and terror. And the emperors loved it too. They used these events to show their generosity, throwing free games to win popularity, and to show their power, reminding everyone who held the lives of both beasts and men in their hands. The animals themselves played a strange role in all this. They weren't just executioners, they were symbols. Lions stood for Rome's ferocity, bears for brute strength, elephants for the empire's reach into foreign lands. Even the variety of animals sent a message: Rome ruled the world, and it could summon its wildest creatures to serve its justice. And if the beasts didn't perform on cue, no problem. The handlers had tricks, hot irons, whips, starvation. The show always went on. For the condemned, there was no hope of survival. This wasn't combat, like gladiators facing each other. There were no rules, no fair fight. Once you were in the arena, you were as good as dead. Your screams, your struggle, your final moments, they were all part of the script. And if you think the Romans gave you a chance to die with dignity, think again. The entire setup was designed to strip you of humanity, to reduce you to prey in front of tens of thousands of jeering faces. But here's where Rome's cruelty gets even sharper. Not everyone faced damnatio ad bestias. Punishments depended on your class. The wealthy and powerful, the honestias, might be allowed exile, a clean beheading, or even forced suicide. Painful, yes, but dignified in a Roman sense. The lower classes, the humiliors, didn't get that courtesy. For them it was the mind's crucifixion or the beast's. The message was clear: not all lives were equal, and even in death, your status determined how you left this world. And yet, out of this horror, something unexpected happened. For the early Christians condemned to the arena, death by beasts became a badge of honor. Instead of silencing them, the spectacle turned them into martyrs. Stories spread of believers facing lions with calm prayers on their lips, or refusing to bow even as claws tore at their flesh. To Roman crowds, it was supposed to be a warning. To Christians, it became proof of faith. In that twist, the empire's tool of terror helped fuel the very religion it tried to stamp out. Still, for most victims, there was no glory, just fear, pain, and the roar of the crowd blending with the roar of the animals. Imagine standing there, the gates opening, the lion's golden eyes fixing on you. The world shrinks to a heartbeat, a breath, and then the rush of fur and claws. The crowd leans forward, eager. You stumble, fall, scream. And then, it's over. Quick or slow, graceful or grotesque, it doesn't matter. To Rome, you were never more than part of the show. That's the essence of damnatio ad bestias. It wasn't about justice in any true sense. It wasn't about reforming criminals or balancing scales. It was about fear, control, and entertainment rolled into one bloody package. It told the people step out of line, and you could be here. It reminded the provinces Rome has the power to turn your life into a plaything, and it kept the masses entertained, feeding them a spectacle so visceral they couldn't look away. So when we think of the Colosseum, we often picture gladiators battling under the sun. But just as often, those sands ran red not with duels, but with executions, stories staged with claws and teeth, designed to terrify, amuse, and remind the empire of its own power. It's unsettling, it's gruesome. But it was Rome. Not every Roman who fell out of favor ended up in the Colosseum or hurled from a cliff. If you were unlucky and low-born, yes, you might find yourself facing beasts or crosses. But if you were part of the elite, things played out differently. Rome had a very clear line between punishments for the common man and punishments for those in silk togas. And this is where one of the strangest contradictions in Roman justice comes in, the mercy of forced suicide. Now, calling it mercy might sound strange. After all, it's still a death sentence. But in Rome, the difference between being dragged through the streets to the arena and being handed a polite scroll that basically said, "Do the honorable thing and end it yourself," was massive. For the upper classes, the honestiors, this was the empire's way of saying, "We're giving you a chance to leave with dignity." It was harsh, but it was also strangely considerate in its own Roman way. Picture it: a senator has offended the emperor. Maybe he whispered too loudly in a corner. Maybe he plotted an uprising. Or maybe he simply had the misfortune of being popular enough to be seen as a threat. Soldiers wouldn't storm his house in the middle of the night to drag him to some pit. Instead, a messenger would arrive, a scroll in hand. The senator would unroll it and read words that left no room for doubt. "The emperor has judged you. You are to take your own life. By sundown." The rules were unspoken but understood. Do it quietly, do it quickly, and your family keeps their property, their house, their place in society. Resist, and not only will you be killed brutally, but everything you own will be confiscated, your name erased from honor, and your children cast out into disgrace. That choice wasn't really a choice at all. It was the empire's way of saying, "We'll give you the appearance of control, but the ending is already written." And yet, some Romans embraced it. For philosophers like Seneca the Younger, forced suicide wasn't just a punishment. It was a chance to prove what they'd been preaching their whole lives. Seneca, accused of conspiring against Nero, chose to end his life in a way that was almost theatrical. He cut his wrists and ankles, stepped into a warm bath, and spoke calmly to his friends as the life drained from him. For him, and for others like him, this final act became a kind of performance of Roman values: courage, self-control, acceptance of fate. It's dark, yes, but in Roman eyes, it was noble. Death wasn't the worst thing that could happen to you. Dishonor was. Being marched in chains, beaten, mocked, fed to beasts, that was humiliation. But to choose your own exit, that was power. Even at the end, you had some say over how you left this world, and Rome respected that. In fact, in many cases, your name wasn't dragged through the mud afterward. your family wasn't punished. It was as if the state said, "We'll let you write your own final chapter, as long as it ends the way we want it to." Think about how strange that is. In the same empire where slaves could be branded on the face and rebels crucified by the thousands, nobles could get a quiet farewell in their villa, surrounded by family. Two completely different systems of justice existing side by side, one built on terror, the other on a twisted form of respect. But here's the catch: even this respect was about control. The emperor didn't hand out these scrolls out of kindness. He did it to maintain order, to remind the elites that they were still under his power, no matter how wealthy or connected they were. It was a softer tool, but it sent the same message: Rome decides when you live and when you die. And the people knew this. They whispered about the suicides of senators, philosophers, generals. Each one became a cautionary tale, a reminder that no one, no matter how high, was untouchable. The common people watched from afar, maybe even envying the nobility for getting an easier end. But they understood the bigger picture. Rome wasn't merciful. Rome was calculating. You can almost imagine the mood inside a wealthy Roman home on the day such a message arrived. Servants going silent, family members pale, whispering in corners. The condemned man sitting quietly, maybe writing final words, maybe dictating them to a scribe. Then, when the time came, he'd gather those closest to him, say goodbye, and take the step Rome had demanded. Behind the curtain of dignity, the hand of the state was still there, pushing him toward the inevitable. So while it might sound strange to call forced suicide a lighter punishment in the world of Rome, it was exactly that. It allowed the elite to avoid the public shame of execution, to preserve their family's future, and even to play one last role in the theatre of Roman life. In a society obsessed with honor, this was as close to mercy as Rome ever got. And that's the paradox of Roman justice: brutal to some, almost respectful to others, but at its core, always the same lesson: Rome was in control. Whether you were a slave in chains or a senator with scroll in hand, your fate wasn't truly your own. It was the empire's. Now, if you've noticed a pattern, Rome never ran out of ideas when it came to punishing people. Sometimes it was fire, sometimes it was cliffs, sometimes it was lions. But other times, it was tools of humiliation. Punishments designed not just to hurt, but to mark you, to make you live with the shame every single day. These weren't always about killing. Sometimes they were about making your body the message, turning you into a walking billboard of disgrace. And in some ways, those punishments were even crueler, because they followed you for the rest of your life. Take the infamous wooden donkey. Now, this wasn't a cuddly toy or even a real animal. It was a torture device shaped like an A-frame with a razor-sharp ridge running along the top. The condemned, usually a thief, a slave, or a rebellious soldier, would be forced to straddle it. Imagine sitting on a narrow, pointed beam, all your weight pressing down, cutting into you in the worst possible place. To make it even more unbearable, executioners sometimes tied weights to the victim's ankles so gravity could help do the work. The longer you sat, the worse it got. It wasn't necessarily about death. Sometimes they'd pull you off before that point. But the damage, the pain, and the humiliation, those stayed. And, of course, they didn't do this in private. Oh no. Crowds would gather. Kids would laugh. Vendors would sell food. Someone's agony became the afternoon's entertainment. Then there was branding. In a world without ID cards or mugshots, Rome found its own way to keep track of criminals, burn it right onto their skin. If you were caught stealing, running away as a slave, or caught lying under oath, you might have a hot iron pressed to your forehead or cheek, scarring you with a permanent mark. Letters like for fur, thief, or C. For calumniators, false accuser became part of your face. Runaway slaves often got FUG, seared into their skin, short for fugitivus. Imagine trying to live with that. Everywhere you went, people saw the brand before they saw the person. It wasn't just pain. It was permanent exile from dignity, a life sentence of suspicion and shame. And just to make sure nobody got clever, Rome punished people who tried to cover up their brands. If you cut into it, tattooed over it, or used makeup to disguise it, that was another crime. They wanted those marks visible, a constant reminder that the state owned not just your body in that moment, but your reputation forever. Later emperors softened it slightly, moving the branding to the hands or legs. But by then the damage had already been done. Generations of people had been turned into walking warnings. And if branding wasn't enough, Rome had another favorite way to silence those who stepped out of line, cutting out the tongue. Yes, literally. Speak against the gods, mock the emperor, whisper something that smelt of rebellion, and soldiers could clamp your tongue and slice it off. In some cases, they ripped it out completely. Brutal, bloody, and devastating. Even if you survived, you'd never speak the same again. Your voice, your very means of expressing yourself, was gone. Imagine how terrifying that must have been in a culture built on rhetoric, speeches, and public life. Losing your tongue didn't just wound your body, it erased your ability to defend yourself, to persuade, to belong. It turned you into a living symbol of what happens when words go too far. And then there was breaking on the wheel. This was one of those punishments that blurred the line between execution and art. If by art you mean a gruesome, twisted display, a large wooden wheel was laid flat or propped up, and the condemned was tied to it, limbs spread wide like a star. Then came the executioner, armed with a heavy iron bar. Slowly, methodically, he would smash the bones, one by one. Arms, legs, ribs, broken but not killed. The goal wasn't quick death. It was transformation, turning the human body into something grotesque, bent and folded in ways it was never meant to be. Once the bones were shattered, the broken body was woven through the wheel spokes, creating a horrifying display for everyone to see. Sometimes the wheel was lifted upright, sometimes it was left to spin slowly in the wind. Either way, the condemned didn't just die, they decayed in public, their body becoming a kind of warning sculpture. These punishments had a theme: humiliation. They didn't always kill instantly. They dragged things out, made the pain visible, and left marks that could never be hidden. That was Rome's genius, in a dark sense. They knew death ended quickly, but shame lived on. A man branded in the face carried his crime into every marketplace, every tavern, every glance from a stranger. A soldier who'd straddled the wooden donkey never forgot the agony. A body displayed on the wheel reminded everyone who walked past. Step out of line, and this could be you. It wasn't just about cruelty for cruelty's sake. It was about control. Rome turned people into examples, into tools of propaganda. By punishing some in ways that lasted far beyond the moment, they kept everyone else in check. And as much as we might flinch now, that strategy worked. The stories, the scars, the whispers, they carried farther than any decree ever could. So, when we look back at these punishments, it's not just the pain that stands out. It's the way they invaded every part of a person's life. Their body, their reputation, even their silence. Rome didn't just want obedience. Rome wanted to own your memory. And that's why punishments like the wooden donkey, branding, tongue removal, and the wheel linger so strongly in history. They weren't just methods of justice. They were tools of fear, humiliation, and spectacle. When you think Rome couldn't possibly get any darker or more theatrical with its punishments, you meet Nero, the emperor who turned cruelty into performance art, who thought executions could double as after-dinner entertainment. Under him, punishment wasn't just about silencing enemies. It was about staging a show that no one would ever forget. And two of the most bizarre, most chilling methods linked to his reign still echo through history: execution by hot ash and the tunica molesta, the burning death robe. Let's start with the hot ash. On paper, it doesn't sound nearly as terrifying as lions or crucifixion. Ash is soft, right? It's what you brush off your hands after a fire. But in the twisted mind of Nero, ash became a weapon. Imagine being buried up to your neck in pit, unable to move. At first, you might think this is going to be a beheading or stoning, brutal. but over quickly. Instead, a funnel is forced into your mouth. Thin, slowly, deliberately, hot ash is poured in. Not a bucketful, not all at once. A steady stream, filling your throat, clogging your lungs, suffocating you grain by grain. The horror of it was in the slowness. Each breath became harder, every swallow a struggle. The ash seared as it went down, choking and burning from the inside. It wasn't dramatic on the outside, no flailing, no blood. To the onlookers, it might have seemed almost calm. A head in the dirt, a trickle of grey dust. But inside, the victim was drowning in fire and grit, dying in silence while everyone watched. That's what made it so sinister. Rome could turn even dust into a weapon, and Nero revelled in the sheer humiliation of it. To die in ash was to be reduced to nothing, not even worthy of steel or flame. Then there was the tunica molesta, the so-called troublesome tunic. Only, this tunic was more than troublesome. It was deadly. Picture it: a condemned man is dragged into the arena, maybe tied to a stake, maybe just shoved into the sand for all to see. Instead of chains or ropes, he's handed a tunic to wear. At first glance, it looks like a regular garment, but the fabric is dripping with pitch, tar, and oil, soaked until it clings to the skin. Once it's fitted snug, the executioner steps forward with a torch. In a flash, the victim is engulfed in flames. The tunic sticks to the body, melting into flesh, turning every attempt to escape into agony. The more the victim flails, the tighter the burning fabric clings. And Nero, in all his twisted imagination, didn't waste such a spectacle. According to some accounts, he used the tunica molesta during his infamous garden parties. Picture a lush garden at night, torches flickering, music playing, nobles reclining with wine in hand. But those torches, lighting the pathways, weren't wooden poles with flames at the top. They were human beings wrapped in burning tunics, screaming into the night as the emperor smiled and his guests looked on. That's not punishment. That's cruelty turned into decor. The tunica molesta wasn't limited to Nero's parties either. It was used against arsonists, traitors and Christians who refused to bow to Rome's gods. To the crowd, it was both justice and entertainment. To the state, it was a way of saying step out of line, and we'll turn your body into a candle. It was horrifying, humiliating, and unforgettable, exactly what Rome wanted. And as if death itself wasn't enough, the Romans invented a punishment that went beyond the grave damnatio memoria, the condemnation of memory. This wasn't about killing your body. This was about killing your legacy. If Rome decided you had shamed the state, your name, your image, your memory were erased. Statues were smashed or chiseled down. Inscriptions were scratched out. Your name was scraped off coins, paintings, official records. Even portraits were altered, leaving ghostly outlines where your face had once been. One of the most famous examples was Gaeta, the brother of Emperor Caracolla. After Caracolla had him killed, he didn't stop at the body. He ordered Gaeta's name removed from every monument, every inscription, every record he could find. Thousands of stone carvings were altered by hand. On arches, in mosaics, even on family portraits. Gaeta was scratched out as if he had never existed. And in some pieces that survive today, you can still see the awkward gaps, half faces, and empty spaces where he used to be. It's chilling, like history caught in the act of erasing itself. Think about how terrifying that must have been. Death was one thing. Everyone expected that sooner or later. But being erased, having your life's work, your very name, wiped away as if you never walked the earth, that was a fate worse than death for a Roman. Because for them, legacy was everything. To be remembered was to live forever. To be forgotten was to vanish twice. And yet, the irony is this: in trying to erase these people, Rome made them unforgettable. We talk about Gaeta, about the emperors and generals who were condemned to memory's trash heap, precisely because their stories of erasure survived. But in their own time it worked. People feared being forgotten. They feared seeing their names hammered off a marble tablet or their statues mutilated beyond recognition. Rome didn't need lions or fire for this one. Just a chisel and the will to blot you out of history. when you step back and look at all these punishments. Nero's fiery tunics, the suffocating ash, the branding, the wheel, the rock, the sack. It becomes clear that Rome's genius lay not just in inventing pain, but in inventing fear. They didn't just want people to obey, they wanted people to remember, to tell their children, to whisper the stories in marketplaces and taverns. Punishments weren't private affairs, they were public theatre, carefully staged to send a message: Rome is eternal, you are not. And in that way, even today, they succeeded. We're still telling these stories, still shuddering at the thought of them, still marveling at how far an empire would go to control its people. Rome's roads may crumble, its emperors long gone, but its punishments live on in memory,